He's a multimillionaire mover and shaker, but you wouldn't recognise his face or his name. For decades, businessman and keen environmentalist Robert Purves has dedicated himself to protecting some of Australia's key wild habitats. He's also invested millions into scientific research and public advocacy around big problems like global warming and water reform. In his first television profile, Robert Purves says he's stepping out to support the science on climate change. Sarah Dingle reports.
On the other side of the world lies a land of ice and snow. And here in Greenland is Australian businessman and philanthropist Robert Purves.
Actually seeing what's happening in the field with the melting of the ice, it's on a scale that's just enormous.
When he's passionate on something, he delves deep into getting to understand it.
I think it's entirely in his character that Rob's gone to Greenland to see for himself the evidence.
Robert Purves has come here to inspect the front line of global warming.
Of all the key tipping points, if you like, in the climate change debate, the one that scientists worry about the most is Greenland. Just seeing how in summer, with higher average temperatures that are now being experienced there, how much of the ice on the surface at least, and around the edge of Greenland, is starting to melt.
What's becoming increasingly obvious on the surface is the phenomenon known as moulins, where meltwater trickles down holes in the ice, reaching the rock below. There it can lubricate the base of the ice, potentially making the ice sheet unstable. NASA imaging shows a rising trend in melting. Scientists say 2007 was a record year, with at least 40% of the cap affected.
More of the mass of the Greenland ice sheet is being lost than is being replenished by snow.
David VAUX has been Robert Purves' right-hand man for years. Together they ran the billion-dollar DCA Group, a radiology and aged care provider. But he wasn't surprised when in 2004, Robert Purves decided to put his money where his mouth was.
Sold about half of his DCA shares and invested $10 million in his own environmental fund, which I think was an extraordinary thing to do.
Through that fund, Robert Purves has built a green portfolio, backing many of the high-profile environmental campaigns of the last decade.
You know, I think Rob's greatest achievement really was bringing together the Wentworth Group to deal with water issues in Australia.
Almost a decade ago, over a late dinner, Robert Purves created the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, which included former Australian of the Year, Professor Tim Flannery.
Now, I remember when Alan Jones was on radio talking about turning the rivers inland, and that was what galvanised the scientists.
Their response was to form a rallying point for science-based water policy.
It's been a whole career trying to explain to the Australian public and to politicians that we need to live with this cycle of drought and floods, and that Australia pushing all this water onto an old, crusty, salty continent wasn't such a good idea.
Rob got behind us and we produced the blueprint for the basin, and as a result of that we've now had federal control of water. We're on track to get 2,800 gigalitres brought back.
Robert Purves' fight for water reform isn't his only battle. He's provided significant funding for Professor Flannery's book, The Weathermakers, donated millions to the purchase of key conservation land in Tasmania, and spent years leading WWF and campaigns such as Earth Hour. Coming from a leading pastoralist family, Robert Purves' own environmentalism began with a childhood on the land.
Australia's greatest conservationists are farmers. I don't know any farmer who doesn't want to hand his property on to his children in a better state than maybe what he inherited. Now, Sarah, this is the first diesel-electric locomotive built by Clyde in Australia in 1951.
So his father, Sir Raymond, was a pioneer of Australian railways. For years, head of the engineering group Clyde Industries, later Downer EDI Rail.
Well, my father was an industrialist, so telling him I wanted to be a zoologist exactly was probably the last thing he'd wanted ever to hear. My father died when I was 16, and maybe that was around 12 or something. I told him that, so I think I was trying to explain to him I had a great love of nature.
Clyde pioneered the introduction of diesel-electric locomotives and has participated in every facet of rail vehicle technology.
Instead of zoology, he ended up taking the reins of his family's business empire at a young age.
I think one of the things I do know is that you particularly sense an urgency of time. The whole walk here, we've heard rumblings like in the background now of the ice, not necessarily falling off at the cliff here, but falling within the glacier. As a non-scientist, sometimes I don't have all the answers to people's questions on climate. If you've physically been somewhere, you can say, well, look, I've actually seen it.
But he backs the work of climate researchers such as oceanographer Dr. John Church, who says the melting ice is reaching a tipping point.
What we've observed over recent years is both the surface melting has increased and also, particularly in the last 2 decades, the discharge of ice into the ocean has increased. The Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets are the 2 big wild cards here.
There in Greenland alone, if it starts to really run away, the impacts on humanity are massive.
Robert Purves is planning to return to Greenland with a group of climate skeptics and to continue to speak up for the science.
Now, if my father's around, I think no doubt now will say, well, you're off to be the zoologist, I suppose.
Sarah Dingle reporting.